The story of the Saints began with the formation of the Rebels back in 1949. The Rebels were founded in the back of the yards as mostly a Polish white gang, and they began to become very popular in the mid-1950s. The Rebels began making the news in 1956, and from there, their popularity exploded. The Rebels were so much of a powerful group that their territory expanded the entire back of the yards community, and even beyond the borders, and expanded all the way to the suburbs. The Rebels were Chicago's first super gang, having about 2,500 members at their peak. But this was all prior to 1960, therefore much of their history is lost. The Rebels mostly ran back of the yards and even started opening up businesses. In the beginning of 1959 is when the Rebels started to take a lot more heat from law enforcement. So members began to leave that group and start their own groups, and one of them groups was the Saints. The Saints were basically born out of the Rebels, and even older Rebels started the Saints in 1959. Many people in the neighborhood were unaware of this transition and assumed these members were still rebels. The first time any people in the community knew of the Saints was in 1960, when young members like Rabbi and his brother Monk and Frank M became present in the streets. The first Saint hangout was at Gus Snack Shop at 1620 West 47th and Marshfield. The Rebels were one very tough greaser club that had major influence and respect in the neighborhood. These guys were some of the toughest greasers in all of Chicago, and they eventually dominated all the other gangs in the neighborhood. When the Ravens broke away from the Rebels in 1964, the Saints soon gained major notoriety for fighting the Ravens. Even though the Saints were headquartered at 45th and Wood, from the start they had always been in control of the area of 43rd and 47th, and from Ashland to Damon. Saints were allied with Cool Gents, Cornell Dukes, and the Unicorns, and the Saints mainly fought with outsider gangs from outside the neighborhood. The Saints also had religious beliefs, as whenever they would pass a church, they would do a sign of the cross, which indicated the original members may have had a strong Catholic faith. Doing a sign of the cross became a tradition of the Saints for generations to come. The newer generation that began in 1960 brought in more Hispanic members than before, as more Hispanics were moving into the neighborhood. Now the newer Saints would begin clashing with the Burger King boys that would begin in the mid-1960s. It was this newer generation of Saints that established a close relationships with the Spanish Chincellas of Bridgeport that formed in 1960, which this was a Mexican gang from 27th and Normal. The Chincellas were one of the few allies that the Saints would have. Another was the Latin Counts from 18th Street. The Saints really had no allies with other gangs in the back of the yards in the early days until the 1990s. This is because they were so territorial and dominant in their community. In 1966, the Saints began a battle with the newly formed Gaylords of Garfield Boulevard in Ashland. And in the same year, the Burger King boys was formed right by the Gaylords, and the Saints fought them too. And by 1969 or 1970, the Rebels would begin to close operations, leaving the neighborhood to become dominated by the Saints. The first major gang to successfully settle in the back of the yards were the Latin Kings that settled on 51st and Ada in the year of 1972. This was not an official branch of the Latin Kings until 1980, but it was a menacing outside element for the Saints and began a war. The Latin Kings would then become the worst enemies of the Saints in history, as the feud would go on for decades to come. In the year of 1976, three brothers named Hundo, Tootsie, and Bull moved to the South Chicago neighborhood at 87th and Houston, starting the first branch of Saints outside of the back of the yards neighborhood. Saints would end up at odds with Latin Kings in this area and Spanish Kings. By 1980, the Saints had a tough decision when members became incarcerated whether to join the People or Folk Alliance in the correctional system. And by this time, all gangs in the jail needed to align with either side if they wanted to survive. So they decided to join the Folk Alliance, which was very hard to decide because some of their worst enemies was a part of that, like the Latin Souls, Satan Disciples, 2-6, and the Tutu Boys. The Saints were for sure not joining the People's Alliance because one of their worst enemies, the Latin Kings, was a part of that. And the decision turned out to be a good one for the Saints because they built a strong relationship with the Latin folks in the prison system and gained respect from them as well. The Saints honored the Latin folks by becoming known as the Latin Saints behind bars. and they adopted the pitchfork as a symbol while locked up. Some of the older saints even got the pitchfork tatted on them. But once a saint got out of prison, he was no longer Folks or Latin Saint. The name Latin Saints and Folk Alliance never made it into the streets throughout Saints history, and wars with the Folks continued viciously. In the year of 1980, Saints experienced many more gang wars and violence against enemies, as Mexican migration to the back of the yards became large. 2-6 came in boldly and settled at 47th and Damon, which was at the edge of Saint territory. Saints attacked the 2-6 so viciously that they needed to team up with the Party Player 2 years later just to handle the Saints. And the Party Players even needed assistance against the Saints. Plus, Latin Souls migrated to 55th and 49th, which clashed with the Saints too. Latin Kings were now official at 51st and Ada, and the war was on. Satan Disciples and Tutu Boys settled at 51st and Wood together, which ignited a war with them too. The Saints found none of these migrating gangs to be allies and aimed to destroy them all. For the next few decades, the Saints would do incredible damage to these organizations, despite being outnumbered. The branch of Saints from South Chicago rebranded themselves in 1981 as Saint Spanish Gangster Disciples, as they allied with Gangster Disciples and had influence from Maniac Latin Disciples. And by 1983, the Saint Spanish Gangster Disciples became Spanish Gangster Disciples, which they are now known today as they separated from the Saints. In the year of 1989, Green Eyes from the Saint, while incarcerated, came in contact with Lord Gino, which was the leader of the Latin Kings, and basically began the Saints' influence into joining the People's Alliance in the prison system. And by the year of 1990, the Saints were hanging out with the Latin Kings in the streets. In the year of 1994, the Latin Kings shot up a member of the Saints and killed him, and the Saints were more than willing to go to war. After this happened, the Saints returned to their renegade philosophy and were never big on the People's Alliance on the streets after the early 1990s. In the early and mid 1990s, many small crews started up in the back of the yards that wanted to prove themselves, and they were willing to fight anyone to achieve this title. It was crews like Latin Taste, Turbo Boys, Night Riders, D-Boys, plus Polani Boys, Honor Boys, and Wood Boys. The Saints admired all of these new and upcoming crews, and if they was down enough, they would convince them to join the Saints. Before you knew it, all of these up and coming crews joined the Saints, and the Polani Boys proved to be an excellent investment for the Saints. The Polani Boys fraction ventured into the Bridge Park neighborhood and opened up territory at 42nd Place and Albany. Another location was in the Bridgeport neighborhood at Archer Ave and Locke. This new turf ended up bringing the Saints more trouble and had the police focus more on them because they had a citywide reputation for being violent. The Polanas were overzealous and wanted to expand further, but overall leadership saw that there was no potential in the satellite locations and shut them all down by the end of 1990s. As of today, the Saints are still active, and these guys beef hard with Lil Rosin. But that'll be about it for this video. Make sure you like or dislike, comment, and subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what y'all want to see next. And as always, stay blessed and stay well. Yeah, I'm out.